Statement, the Prime Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I should like to make a statement about recent developments in relation to the Falkland Islands and South Georgia. In our continuing pursuit of a negotiated settlement, my right honourable friend, the Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary, visited Washington on the 22nd and 23rd of April. He had many hours of intensive, detailed discussion with Mr. Hague. Their talks proved constructive and helpful, but there are still considerable difficulties. Mr. Hague now intends to pursue his efforts further with the Argentine government. However, the Argentine Foreign Minister is reported to be unwilling to continue negotiations at present. I hope he will reconsider this. As the British task force approaches closer to the Falklands, the urgent need is to speed up the negotiations, not to slow them down. We remain in close touch with Mr. Hague. I now turn to events on South Georgia yesterday. The first phase of the operation to repossess the island began at first light when the Argentine submarine Santa Fe was detected close to British warships which were preparing to land forces on South Georgia. The United Kingdom had already made it clear to Argentina that any approach on the part of Argentine warships, including submarines, or military aircraft, which could amount to a threat to or interfere with the mission of British forces, would encounter the appropriate response. The Santa Fe posed a significant threat to the successful completion of the operation and to British warships and forces launching the landing. Helicopters therefore engaged and disabled the Argentine submarine. Just after 4 p.m. London time yesterday, British troops landed on South Georgia and advanced towards Grytviken. At about 6 o'clock, the commander of the Argentine forces in Grytviken surrendered, having offered only limited resistance. British forces continued to advance during the night and are now in control of Leith, the other main settlement on South Georgia. At 10 o'clock this morning, the officer commanding the Argentine forces on South Georgia formally surrendered. British forces throughout the operation used the minimum force necessary to achieve a successful outcome. No British casualties have been notified, and it is reported that only one Argentine sustained serious injuries. About 180 prisoners were taken, including up to 50 military reinforcements who had been on the Argentinian submarine. The prisoners will be returned to Argentina. British Antarctic Survey personnel on the island were reported to be safe when we last heard from them early yesterday afternoon. Our forces are now making contact with them. Arrangements are in hand to evacuate them if they so wish. I'm sure the House will join me in congratulating our forces on carrying out this operation successfully and recapturing the island. The action we have taken is fully in accord with our inherent right of self-defense under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friends and I will continue to keep the House fully informed on the situation as it develops. I should like to emphasise that the repossession of South Georgia, including the attack on the Argentine submarine, in no way alters the government's determination to do everything possible to achieve a negotiated solution to the present crisis. We seek the implementation of the Security Council resolution, and we seek it by peaceful means, if possible.
Michael Foot.
Could I say to the Right Honourable Lady that I'm sure she must appreciate that along with other moods there is also a deepening sense of anxiety throughout the country, and I trust that she and the government will take account of it. On the South Georgia issue, let me say the whole country, I'm sure, will be relieved that the operation was carried through without loss of life on our side or serious injury on either side. We are entitled to stress to all concerned the recovery of South Georgia was fully within our international rights. It was not a breach of the Charter in any sense, as some have falsely alleged. Indeed, it may help us in other fields, particularly in view of the extreme skill with which it was executed. Of course, the Falklands and South Georgia are two very different propositions, and I'm sure the House and the country understand that as well. However, the most important and persistent question remains, and indeed is intensified, and I put the questions in the light of what the Right Honourable Lady has just said to us. How are we to pursue the search for the diplomatic settlement and the peaceful settlement to which she refers? What is to happen next in this field when she talks of speeding up the negotiations? What steps are the government taking to speed up those negotiations? What is the stage at which the negotiations with the mediation of Mr. Hague, what is the stage which that has now reached? And what happens if that mediation is not able to be pursued? What happens, for example, the question that we have constantly asked throughout the discussions, I see it is reiterated in a very notable leading article, I would say, in the Financial Times today. Why have we so far refused to go back to the Security Council, or perhaps if I could put the question to the Right Honourable Lady in a way she might prefer, when are we going to return to the Security Council on these matters? And how are we to ensure, in the meantime, not merely assure, but to be absolutely sure, that there will be no dangerous escalation of the crisis in any way? What is the form of political control over military operations? That political control in such a situation as this must be absolute, without any possibilities of any mistake whatever. We on this side of the House remain as firmly, unshakably, persistently committed to fresh initiatives in search of a peaceful settlement, and if one initiative fails, then another has to be started. And in the meantime, yes, indeed, that's the spirit in which the government should be going about their business. And in the meantime, let us take account of the fact that whereas, as I retract nothing what I've said about the feat in South Georgia, but what is legal is not necessarily also prudent, and that has to be taken into account as well. The search for peace must never be torpedoed by us, and I believe that this House can play a considerable part in ensuring that that spirit shall inform all our actions that are taken. And so therefore I ask the Right Honourable Lady not merely to agree to report to this House consistently, but to report to us a good deal more fully than we've yet had reports. The reports about the negotiations and the possible options, there is still very much to be reported to this House on these questions, and I believe the best course would be for the Right Honourable Lady not only to agree, of course, to give reports over the next few days to the House, but to agree that we should have a debate in the House on Thursday. I believe that this is the way in which the House should, I believe, and we on this side of the right to speak on these matters, I believe we in this House of Commons should keep a persistent control over what the government proposes and intends, and I ask the Prime Minister to accede to that request here and now.
Mr. Speaker, may I first thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for the remarks at the beginning of his intervention, especially for stressing that we had a right to recapture South Georgia in accordance with the rules of the United Nations Charter, and join him, of course, in congratulating our forces on the professional skill with which they carried out their task. He says that people are anxious. We share that anxiety in the search for a diplomatic settlement. It is, after all, 3 weeks, more than 3 weeks, since the United Nations Security Council resolution calling upon the Argentinian forces to withdraw. During that time, far from withdrawing, They have put reinforcements of equipment and men and materials on the island. And if we have not yet reached a settlement, then the blame lies at the foot of the Argentinian government. We naturally are ready and anxious at any time to continue these negotiations and stay constantly in touch with Mr. Hague. I hope that Mr. Costa Mendes will reconsider his decision not to see Mr. Hague and will see him shortly. If not, of course, Mr. Hague can communicate with the Argentinian government in other ways. The Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned the United Nations. It is, of course, the United Nations Security Council resolution that we want implemented, but I think it's generally felt I don't think there's any disposition in New York to involve the United Nations further while the negotiations with Mr. Hague are still continuing. I am just reporting what I believe to be the position in New York at the United Nations. I believe that most people there reckon that the best hope for a peaceful settlement is through the negotiations with Mr. Hague, and I believe myself that we must continue those negotiations with all possible speed. Yes, of course we search for peace. We did not break the peace, but we must in fact remember that while we search for that peace, our people, British people, are under the occupation of the Argentinian invader. And we must remember that in the way in which we carry out these negotiations. The Right Honourable Gentleman asked for a debate. I hope that he will perhaps pursue that through the usual channels.
Michael Foot.
We certainly will pursue it through the usual channels, but I hope that the Right Honourable Lady will make sure that we have... she's got some influence with the Right Honourable Gentleman. After all, she's only just appointed him. She's got some influence with him, I've no doubt, and I think we should have another debate in the House this week, and I say we're entitled to have such a debate, particularly in the light, I must say, of the Right Honourable Lady's replies about what is to be done about getting the negotiations going. She's only had one half sentence on that subject, and that we are keeping in touch with Mr. Hague. That's all she has to say about the actual way in which we are making some effort to get the negotiations proceeding. So I hope the Right Honourable Lady will agree to the debate and give us a much more responsive reply on that aspect of the matter too.
I trust that the Right Honourable Gentleman will nevertheless pursue it through the usual channels. I cannot give him, as I think he would understand, details of negotiations while they continue, but we do pursue them as vigorously as we possibly can. And after all, what we are asking for is the withdrawal of the Argentinian troops in accordance with the United Nations Security Council resolution.
Sir Derek Walker-Smith.
Honourable friend, clarify the position in regard to the reference of this dispute to the International Court of Justice, a matter referred to in the leader in the Financial Times, mentioned by the Right Honourable Gentleman, and also in the Times and the Sunday Telegraph. Can she say that subject to the Argentines' prior withdrawal of troops in conformity with United Nations Resolution 502, it is the government's policy to refer the dispute or suggest reference of it to the court in accordance with the United Nations Charter and the statute of the court? If unhappily there should be a drift to war without any attempt at arbitration, which is so clearly envisaged in the Charter, would not posterity marvel, and might it not condemn?
Mr. Speaker, I believe we referred the matter of the dependencies of the Falklands to the International Court of Justice, and I think the year was 1955. But as my right honourable learned friend will know, both parties have to agree to go to the International Court of Justice for them to adjudicate. We took it. The Argentinians did not agree. So we took the case to the court, but the Argentinians did not agree to the jurisdiction of the court with regard to the dependencies. So it's not for any lack of consent on our part that it is not in fact gone to the International Court of Justice.
Order. I propose to allow 20 minutes for questions today as on the other days. Dr. David Owen.
Is the Prime Minister aware that we on these benches fully and unequivocally support the decision to repossess South Georgia? And we congratulate all of the services and the servicemen who have taken considerable risks and are very grateful for the fact that there has been no loss of life. would the Prime Minister accept that while many of us believe that with the meeting of the Organization of American States taking place in Washington today, it is right to give Secretary Haig a few more days, the time is approaching when the United States, if they are unable to reach movement, will have to make a decision to apply economic sanctions. And can the House be given some assurance that before any major escalation of violence took place, the Prime Minister would be ready to go to the United Nations and discuss under Articles 82 and 83 of the Secure Trust Areas, which would allow, in fact, for British administration the possibility of using those provisions for any interim administration?
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for what he said at the beginning of his remarks. With regard to the United Nations, it is, after all, the implementation of the United Nations resolution, which we are seeking, which United Nations, as the Right Honourable Gentleman knows, is not in a position to implement itself. I repeat what I said to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition. I believe it is right at the moment to continue through Mr. Haig to try to seek a peaceful settlement. With regard to what the Right Honourable Gentleman said about the future course of negotiations on the whole, I must point out to the House that time is getting extremely short as the task force approaches the islands. It has in fact been 3 weeks since that resolution. And of course one cannot just have a wide range of choice, wide range of military options with a task force in the wild and stormy weathers in that area.
Mr. Mark Carlyle.
Having returned from Washington this morning, may I ask my right honourable friend whether she is aware of the absolutely overwhelming support that exists in America for the action that we are taking, and the overwhelming understanding by many members of Congress and others of the fact that the principle of state is of importance to America and the Western world as it is to this country.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. I believe that the American people know that unprovoked aggression must not be allowed to succeed. If it does, then there will be no international law, and many, many peoples will fear for their future.
Mr. Tony Benn.
Is the Prime Minister aware that although the House and the country are united in condemning the aggression, public opinion, as far as it can be ascertained, by a majority, favours a much more serious attempt at negotiation through the United Nations than has occurred, and that a majority of people would not follow the government into a war with the Argentine, which would threaten the loss of many lives, including servicemen and Falkland Islanders, might spread the conflict and would isolate this country. And that if the Prime Minister continues to underrate the importance of negotiation and proceed with the war, the responsibility for the loss of life will rest upon her shoulders.
Mr. Speaker, there is no lack of vigour or will to pursue negotiations on the part of Her Majesty's government. The lack is on the part of the Argentinian government to obey the Security Council resolution. And in the meantime, perhaps the right honourable gentleman will remember that our people are under the heel of the Argentinian invader.
Mr. John Haig.
Speaker, is the Prime Minister aware that few things could do more to bring support to the action which she and the government are taking than that thoroughly mischievous question just asked by the right honourable gentleman?
Arthur Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister tell us what attitude the Commonwealth countries generally take towards government policy, and the countries in the West Indies area in particular?
Mr. Speaker, Commonwealth countries have been most helpful both in condemning the unprovoked aggression of Argentina, and many of them have stopped imports from Argentina. New Zealand has stopped exports as well, and Mr. Fraser has sent a very, very strong message of support to the United States government. Those involved in the Caribbean area, in particular Guyana, is on the Security Council and voted for the United Nations Resolution 502. There are, of course, very, very many territorial disputes in that area, and many people who realize that it is crucial for them that the Argentines should not succeed in their invasion of the Falkland Islands.
Russell Johnston.
Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister convey to the British forces who recaptured South Georgia the admiration of this bench, certainly for the skill, courage and restraint which they demonstrated in conducting the operation? She has, however, emphasized several times today that time is short, with all that that implies. Will she therefore understand that it will inevitably be increasingly difficult to give her a blank cheque without much more information? And has she therefore considered further the suggestion made by my right honourable friend, the leader of the Liberal Party, for all-party discussions on this matter? Finally, can she say more about economic sanctions, in particular the supply of arms? For example, is it true that Israel is supplying ammunition to the Argentine at the present time?
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole House admires what our forces have done, and I, of course, will gladly send a message on behalf of the whole House. With regard to what the Right Honourable Gentleman said about time being short, yes, it is. But there's no lack of will on our part to negotiate. The trouble is in getting the Argentinians to withdraw, and it may not be possible to do it by negotiation, but we're still seeking to do it. But they have, after all, had over 3 weeks in which to comply with that resolution and have shown no inclination to do so whatsoever, indeed have reinforced all their troops. With regard to sanctions, I think the honourable member knows the positions we've expressed it in this House with European sanctions and sanctions on the part of a number of Commonwealth countries. I'm not in a position to say precisely what Israel has or has not supplied to the Argentines.
Mr. Julian Amery.
While joining with other honourable and right honourable members in congratulating the armed forces on the skill with which they liberated the South Georgia, may I also congratulate the government on taking the decision to authorise this operation. While welcoming the decision to keep the door open to negotiation, would my right honourable friend agree that we cannot keep the task force treading water indefinitely at the mercy of the Atlantic storms or the changing tides of political opinion? And would she agree that having once achieved a first success, we must, as soon as all preparations are ready, proceed to the next stage as soon as possible?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and particularly grateful to him for pointing out that time is short because of the weather conditions, because of the distance from home, and because the task force is now approaching those islands, and we must take that into account, and we must therefore do everything we can to speed up these negotiations, and I hope that that message too will get to the Argentinian government, because that's where it needs to go.
Mr. Douglas J.
Is it not clear that there will be a far better prospect of an acceptable negotiated settlement if we meanwhile fully exercise our unchallengeable rights of self-defence?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman. I believe we shall have greater chances of getting a peaceful settlement if we bring greater military pressure to bear on the Argentine government.
Robert Hodes James.
Emphasise that since this government was formed, we have done almost everything to attempt to negotiate a peaceful settlement between 1979 and the advent of hostilities, and have continued to try and do that since. And we should not also emphasise the fact that it is not us, but the Argentines who are in infringement not only of the principle, but also the letter of the United Nations Charter, and our infringement of Resolution 502. And so that although this event, which is tragic, nonetheless represents the fact that we in this country have throughout pursued the course of peace and are now defending our own rights.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I confirm what my honourable friend says. We are doing everything in accordance with the United Nations Charter. We continue to seek a peaceful solution. If we are not successful in achieving one, the fault will not lie with us, nor with Mr. Hague. It will lie fairly and squarely with the Argentinian government.
Eric Ogden.
Would the Prime Minister try to find some time? Would the Prime Minister try to find some time to give her attention to the situation of British Falkland Island citizens here in the United Kingdom, where we have Her Majesty's representative, the Governor, the Deputy Governor, Mr. Baker, two elected representatives, Bill Luxton and John Cheek, who have had some support from the Foreign Office, but not too great. The Foreign Office so far have not been able to find a home for the Governor. He hasn't complained, but I do. The second one, if she would consider the suggestion made by her honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge and I, to the Foreign Office last October, of establishing a Falklands Island Secretariat or government office so that they would have some support and not be dependent on the goodwill of the Foreign Office or the charity of the Falkland Island Office.
Mr. Speaker, I will of course look into the matters which the honourable gentleman has raised and do so urgently. We are in touch with these people. If they need any help, of course we must give it. And as far as the Falkland Islanders in the Falkland Islands are concerned, I have made it perfectly clear that if some of them wish temporarily to be evacuated, and they just haven't the means to do so, that there'll be no difficulty as far as Her Majesty's government is concerned. We will see that the means are provided.
Sir John Eden.
Did not the government make clear from the outset of this business that if the Argentinians would not be talked out of the Falkland Islands, they would have to be fought out? Now that there can be no doubt anywhere about the determination and the ability of us to take any necessary military action, will my right honourable friend ensure that in the continuing negotiations to secure the observance of Resolution 502, she will keep the initiative firmly in her hands?
Mr. Speaker, we are trying constantly to take initiatives to see that the negotiations continue. We shall carry on, and I can only stress there's only one thing that really needs to be done immediately under the Security Council resolution, and that is the withdrawal of Argentinian forces. After that, negotiations can continue. They have, of course, been continuing for many years, but as soon as that is achieved, we're quite prepared to go into negotiations once again.
Sir, the runway at Port Stanley has been strengthened to take Mirage and MiGs and other Skyhawks. What are the consequences for air superiority, and what next for the task force?
Mr. Speaker, sir, I would not wholly accept the premises on which the honourable gentleman's question was founded.
Lord Cunningham.
Directly and through the United Nations, bring to the attention of the Argentine government its obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 with regards to not compelling Falkland Islanders to remain in those parts of the Falkland Islands which may be particularly subject to combat danger.
Mr. Speaker, I will of course consider doing what the honourable gentleman says. Many of the Falkland Islanders have left Port Stanley and gone out to camp, and of course there are far fewer in Port Stanley now than there had previously been, but we'll have a look at the honourable gentleman's suggestion.
Well, I'm sure that it is right and humane to, in these circumstances, to return prisoners of war to the Argentine. Can my right honourable friend say, give us an assurance that if any difficulty over this arises, that names and the state of health of such men is made known to their anxious relatives, in sharp contrast to the inhumane treatment by the fascist junta of the relatives of thousands of Argentinians who've disappeared in recent years, many of whom are now dead.
Mr. Speaker, can I make one point clear? These prisoners are not prisoners of war. A state of war does not exist between ourselves and the Argentine. They are prisoners They will be returned as soon as possible. Of course, we will let their names and state of health be known to their relatives as soon as possible. And I understand that the commander of the Argentinian forces on the island is already very grateful for the very quick medical attention that was given to the one Argentinian Marine who was badly hurt.
Jack Ashley.
Would the Prime Minister agree that this is now the time for a resolution and for her to earn the sobriquet of the Iron Lady? And the way to do that is to stand firm against those wild voices calling for an increase in violence and a drift to war, because Britain nor Argentine can benefit from a war. And will the Prime Minister emphasise that we shall seek a negotiated settlement, and if that requires economic force, we will bring in economic force and economic sanctions and every other sanction short of war, because war would be disastrous.
Mr. Speaker, may I take both of the right honourable gentleman's point? On economic sanctions, of course, a number of countries have joined us in putting economic sanctions on. The right honourable gentleman will know they are slow to operate and they tend not to be wholly successful, as there's a good deal of leakage which tends to take place through third countries. But secondly, may I say to the right honourable gentleman that I do think resolution is required. Resolution to make certain that unprovoked aggression does not succeed.
Nigel Fisher.
Despite what my right honourable friend has just said about economic sanctions, may I revert to the point made by the right honourable member for Plymouth earlier, that as despite his really valiant efforts, Mr. Hague's attempts to mediate have now apparently ended for the time being by decision of the Argentine Foreign Minister, will my right honourable friend reconsider and make the suggestion to the United States government that it might now be appropriate for them to impose economic sanctions against the Argentine, if only to show which side they're on?
Mr. Speaker, I quite understand my honourable friend's feelings and the feeling of many right honourable and honourable gentlemen upon that particular matter in this House. And of course those economic sanctions would be of a kind and a degree greater perhaps than any other that could be brought to bear. But with regard to Mr. Hague's negotiations, I believe he thinks that the meeting with Costa Mendes is only postponed, that it will take place, because even if it doesn't, there are means of negotiating and contacting directly the junta in Argentina.
Eric Deacon.
Why must the pace of negotiations be dictated by the requirements of military strategy in the South Atlantic? Surely our priority should be the other way round.
Mr. Speaker, the pace of negotiations has been very, very swift. But when you have a task force and when you have ships as we had in the South Atlantic in very wild and stormy weathers, that is a limiting factor on your possible military activities, which any sensible government must take into account.
My honourable friend accept that her handling of this crisis has the support of a vast majority of the people of this country. And it is important to continue to follow the policy of the stick and the carrot, the stick to ensure that aggression pays no dividends, and the carrot to show that we have no quarrel with the Argentinian people, only with the illegal actions of our government.
Mr. Speaker, I accept completely that negotiations are more likely to succeed if military pressure is kept up. We always have to consider the military options, and in considering them, we have, of course, to look after our soldiers and Marines who have to undertake them.